Yes, Tim. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to Visit Talks in Economics. Today, we are very pleased to have with us Tim Roughgarden, who is going to talk about Shill-Proof auctions. It's a joint work with Andrew Komo and Scott Kominers, who are also here with us, and that are going to keep an eye on the chat in case you have any question and you prefer to write them down rather than unmute yourself and ask it live. We also have with us the guest panelists, Marek, Pycia, and Zhou, who are also joining us today. Thank you very much for doing so. Let me, before we move to the seminar, remind you that next week we have David Dillenberger from Penn, who's going to talk about allocation mechanisms with mixture-averse preferences. Okay, so Tim, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
All right. Thanks so much for the introduction. And thanks also for the invitation to speak. I know it's sort of a lot of work to run these virtual seminars and especially to kind of nurture a community around them. And I feel like this seminar series has actually done a really great job of that over the last couple of years. So excited to speak to everybody about a paper on Shill-Proof auctions with two great co-authors, Andrew Komo, who's a PhD student at MIT, who you should really keep an eye out for. Andrew is doing amazing work. And then also my colleague at a16z Crypto, Scott Kominers, who's also a professor at Harvard. And I should say, actually, of the many, many joys of sort of working at a16z Crypto, getting to work with great PhD interns like Andrew and getting to work with Scott on a daily basis are very high, very, very high on that list. So very happy to be talking about this work. Okay. And speaking of a16z Crypto, while this was done while Andrew was an intern there, and Scott is also a research partner there, this is just purely academic work. Needless to say, nothing in this talk should be construed as business or investment advice. All right. So auction theory, what could we possibly say new about, for example, single item auctions, right? So Vickery laid out, a lot of the traditions of the field a long time ago. And when Vickery did that, we often think of there being an asymmetry, I'd argue, between how we treat sellers and how we treat bidders, and to what extent they are strategic entities, right? So in the usual setup in auction design, right, you do think of the auction designer as in some sense self-interested. They have an objective function they're interested in, like maybe revenue, and they do commit to an auction design with that in mind ex ante. So maybe they choose an expected revenue maximizing auction, given some prior over bidder valuations. Now, bidders is the usual focus, okay, in auction theory, and the sort of strategic concerns one might have. Okay, one worries about bidders in an auction trying to manipulate the auction outcome through the misreporting of preferences, and so often one works quite hard to design auctions so that in fact bidders are incentivized to report their true preferences. So buyers you really think about as strategic agents. Traditionally, the seller or the auctioneer, whoever it is who actually carries out the auction that was committed to at the beginning, is viewed as a non-strategic actor. Okay, just is someone who just carries out the rules of the mechanism as they were written down. And in a lot of traditional applications, this makes a lot of sense, right? If you're talking about like an FCC spectrum auction, you would hope, who knows, but you would hope that you could trust for example, the U.S. government to actually sort of, run the auction, according to the rules, that they've stipulated. But as time has gone on, right, and auction theory has found, more and more applications, and especially as we've seen this rise of auctions in the digital realm, this assumption has really been sort of called, I think, rightfully be called under question, right? So, for example, if you're talking about, just sort of internet advertising platforms, it's not obvious, right? I mean, so maybe, right? So maybe big tech companies are actually kind of running the mechanisms that they're claiming to, or maybe they're not. And maybe, even though they mean to, sort of inadvertently, optimizations under the hood wind up deviating from the way that auction is described to the public. Certainly, with the recent advent of Web3, so applications that are developed on top of public blockchain protocols, so for example, it's auctions for NFTs, non-fungible tokens, here, it's kind of patently obvious that you should not treat the seller or the auctioneer as some trusted non-strategic entity. Often in public blockchains, it's very explicit that whoever it is carrying out the instructions actually can manipulate it in a number of ways if it's in their own interest. So I just totally made up this phrase, auction theory 2.0. I know it's kind of, I mean, that half tongue in cheek, but also sort of half not, which is, I'd say over this century, and especially over the last 5+ years or so, I think we've seen a number of works in auction theory that really take seriously the idea of the seller or of the auctioneer as a strategic agent, and that perhaps we should think about designing mechanisms so that not only the participants, but also whoever it is who's carrying out the mechanism is appropriately incentivized. So there's a number of examples of this. One that I suspect many of you have heard about and may be top of mind, and I think is good if it is top of mind for you, would be sort of credible auctions. So a landmark paper by Akbarpour and Lee. And we'll return to this a few times because there's a number of compares and contrasts worth doing with our work and the credible auctions work of Akbarpour and Lee. So that is indeed sort of a canonical example of what I mean by this auction theory 2.0. And again, we'll return to credible auctions and what that means and how it compares to shill-proofness a little later on. All right, so in this work, we really drilled down on one specific way that a seller or an auctioneer might deviate from what is intended. And it's a sort of age-old type of deviation in an auction, shill bidding. And for us, shill bidding is going to very much mean just sort of the dictionary definition. It is going to be a seller, either through submitting bids itself or through finding acquaintances or hiring people to submit bids into the auction in order to artificially drive up the selling price of the item in that auction. Okay, so that is what shill bidding means. Okay, having artificial bids in the auction with the sole purpose of driving up the selling price. I thought it was actually kind of interesting in this dictionary definition. It says the illegal practice. I thought that was a little bit of an opinionated definition for a dictionary. Kind of depends on the platform, really, whether it's deemed sort of legal or illegal. But certainly in some platforms, shill bidding is strongly discouraged, let's just say, right? So here's a quote from sort of eBay's policies where they explicitly discuss shill bidding, and they say we explicitly prohibit it. And if you try to do it, we're going to find you, we're going to catch you, and we're going to bust you, right? We're going to I don't know, delete all your accounts and all the reputation you might have accrued with those accounts over the past many years. And, I feel like it's interesting to notice what the eBay material does not say, right? What it does not say is you shouldn't shill bid because it's not in your interest. It would be nice if they could say that, right? It'd be nice if they could say there is this thing shill bidding you could do, but there's no point. Okay? They don't say that. They say you may be tempted to shill bid. You may think it's in your own interest, but using out of mechanism sort of enforcement, detection, and punishment policies, we are going to make sure it's actually not in your interest, or at least that's their intent. Okay. Now, if you spend a little bit of time on eBay forums, or even just there's a research paper all about this, you will find that actually eBay's enforcement policies are imperfect at best. Okay, there is in fact, by all accounts, still lots of shill bidding in eBay auctions. And so in a nice empirical paper by Chen et al. A few years ago, they studied sort of a bunch of auctions for used cars on eBay Motors and found that shilling was rampant. So in over a fifth of the auctions, they had very strong evidence that at least one of the bids submitted in that auction was a shill bid. Okay. And so the point here is, eBay chose to run an auction where there are incentives for sellers to shill. They try to discourage that out of mechanism, and it doesn't totally work. And a natural question then is to say, well, could you actually just, in fact, handle this inside the mechanism itself, just with better incentive design? Okay, could you have an auction that not only hopefully provides good incentives for the buyers, but also provides incentives for good behavior by the seller, okay, that discourages shill bidding. Okay. Were there a couple questions in the chat worth discussing, or I saw a couple pop up, and I'm happy to sort of good.
Actually, the question was mine, but I basically the chat is going to be controlled by your co-author, so okay. Don't worry about the chat.
All right, sounds good. But also, definitely feel free to interrupt me if there's questions that it seems worth kind of handling in line too. Happy to do that. And this is actually this is a very prescient question that's in the chat. This will definitely, we'll see about this. It's a good question, and that'll become clear as we go along. Okay.
Can I ask some clarification question?
Absolutely.
Yep. So here, so what do you mean by so the shell bid in eBay sense is consistent with what you refer to the dictionary, right? So because in my mind, maybe there's some shell bid from the buyer side. For example, suppose I'm a buyer, I can register like different identities, right, to participate in the auction, right? So shell bidding is only referred to the seller side, right?
That's right. That's a good point. So yeah, sometimes you hear about shill bids on the buyer's side, like in multi-item auctions.
Exactly. Yep.
We're not talking about that. We're talking, so I mean, we're going to be focusing on single item auctions, where really I think as opposed to multi-item auctions, and in that context, I think it makes, it's the seller shill
Yep.
bidding is the interesting ones. Yeah.
I see. I just need to confirm because like you refer to some eBay's report, right? So in the eBay's report, what it means is from the seller side, right?
Right.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Good. Other questions?
Well, I mean, if you have time, I think it might make sense to answer the chat question too, since we already talked about it. It's a good question, unless you come to it later.
It is a good question, right? So, and that'll basically the question was about how should one compare and contrast reserve prices to shill bids? And the answer is going to depend in a subtle way on the information available at the time that one might shill. So reserve prices are set ex ante, and in general, it depends on the model, but in many of the cases we'll be looking at, there will be additional information available at the time that shill bidders decide whether or not to shill. So that's the distinction that's going to come up. Okay, great. So this is the question: can we discourage shill bidding, through better auction design? And if so, what are the auction designs that do it? All right, so I'm going to still defer any kind of formal development for a little while. Apologies to those of you that are kind of hungry for the actual formal model and the formal statements. We will get to them. But this is, in my opinion, I think an unusual paper in that a number of the takeaways from this paper, I really think you could actually mention to undergrads in like a beginning auction theory course. And so while there is some, I think, math that we're quite proud of, like in the paper, which is, mostly Andrew's work, just to be clear, I think there's a lot of stuff in the paper that, auction theory nerds will really enjoy. I want to take a good amount of time just to kind of get a feel for this question and get a feel for how familiar auction formats behave with respect to this question of shill bids. Okay, so let's just step through a bunch of examples. So let's start with an English auction. Okay, and the way I'm going to set it up here is not going to be exactly the same as our formal model, but just for now, for simplicity, let's do it this way. So let's suppose we have a single item auction, so one item for sale. We have some number of bidders. Okay, so let's say there's exactly one shill bidder, and there's n minus one. I'll call them real bidders or non-shill bidders. Okay, and let's look at a private value model. So each bidder has a private value for the item. Let's suppose it's from some finite range, maybe like between 0 and 100. For now, bidders, the real bidders have the usual quasi-linear utilities. Okay, so they're just looking to maximize their value if they win, minus whatever price they have to pay for it. We're going to be looking at a symmetric setting throughout this talk. Okay, so bidders' valuations of the real bidders will be drawn IID from some known distribution over the valuation set. Okay, capital F. The shill bidder has no intrinsic value for the item. Their only goal in life is to boost the revenue of the seller. Okay, so that's the utility function of the shill bidder, just the seller's revenue. All right. So for an English auction, for now, let's just think about it working as follows. So we're going to have a price, let's say, starting at 0, incrementing by 1 each iteration. And at each iteration, let's imagine that the bidders are asked one by one, okay, according to some fixed ordering, like first bidder number 1, then bidder number 2, then bidder number 3, and so on. In each iteration, each bidder that hasn't already dropped out is asked whether they are willing to stay in the auction at the current price, P. Okay, so it's either you can drop forevermore, or you can move on to the next iteration. When there's only one bidder remaining, that's the winning bidder, and the price that they have to pay for the item is whatever the most recent price, the highest price that they ever agreed to. Okay, so on this slide, that's what I'm going to mean by an English auction. And so the first question is, right, so there is this shill bidder, okay, they're bidder number N. Can the shill bidder act in any way to boost the seller's expected revenue in this auction?
Tim, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Do the other bidders have beliefs about the existence of a shill bidder, or what do you assume about that actually?
Yeah, so the way we set up the formal model, and I'll talk about this at the time, that the answer to that question will be clear. So we have a way of modeling shill bidders, which we think is very neatly compatible with kind of the usual IPV sort of analysis that we do of auctions. Here, with the English auction, I'm not so much worrying about it, right? So here the bidders have dominant strategies, and so they're not really sort of thinking about I'm thinking that they are not thinking. I'm thinking that the bidders here are really just going to stay in until their value and drop out once the price is bigger than their value.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question. So,
so there are papers that show that a seller actually might want to shill bid in an English auction, right? I mean, shill bidding in general, it's a very it's an important topic, so it's been studied, and English auction in particular, right? So
that's right. So the related work discussion is going to be at the end of the talk. Absolutely. Maybe I should have clarified that at the beginning. We're definitely not the first people to think of shill bidding. But again, at the moment, I'm just stepping through examples, trying to give everybody a feel sort of for this issue. And it's I think very interesting to look at the different, just even speaking on an informal level for now, to observe the subtleness of shill-proofness as we're going to discuss it, and how that varies between different familiar auction formats. So in this case, the answer is yes. Okay, so there is. And the reason is that I started with an English auction with a 0 reserve price. Okay, so I started counting up from 0. And a revenue maximizing seller would not want to do that in general. In general, you're going to want to have a reserve price. And in particular, in this sort of symmetric setting, one natural reserve price to use would be the monopoly price, which is just the optimal take it or leave it offer you would make were there only one bidder with valuation drawn from capital F. Okay, so I'm going to call that R star. So if the base auction format you're starting with is an English auction with no reserve, there's absolutely an incentive to shill to basically, make up the reserve that you wish you had in the first place, right? So the shill bidder can just stay in the auction up until the price hits, say, the monopoly price R star, and then at that point drop out. And that has the effect of sort of within the mechanism, making up the, basically repairing the reserve price R star that you wish you had in the first place. So that's just a warm-up example. And I'm sure you're all noticing it's like, okay, well, that's not that interesting an example, because why not just use the mechanism with the right reserve price, with the monopoly price? Okay, so that's the next thing I want to discuss. So suppose you said, okay, let's actually use an English auction with the right reserve, right? So say like R star, the monopoly price, that's where you start the price and you count up from there. And now I want to ask exactly the same question again. If you actually do start from the monopoly price, is it or is it not the case that the shill bidder is able to boost the seller's revenue by participating in some non-trivial way? And here the answer is actually more subtle. Here the answer is actually it depends. And it depends on sort of the shape on the prior, okay, on the distribution over bidder valuations. Now, for what in auction theory one typically thinks of as the common case, so a regular distribution. So I imagine many of you know what this means, this sort of technical definition. So if F is a regular distribution, then in fact the answer is no. Okay, a shill bidder cannot in fact boost the seller's expected revenue if you start the English auction with the right reserve, if you start it with the monopoly price. Okay,
yeah,
one of multiple equivalent.
Bidders.
Say it again.
With symmetric bidders.
Yeah, symmetric bidders throughout. Yep, but all valuations are IID from capital F at this point. So one of many equivalent ways to think about regular distributions is through a revenue curve. So I've parameterized that here in the lower right. So this is just the revenue you would make from a single bidder with valuation drawn from capital F as a function of the take it or leave it offer that you make them. Okay, so your expected revenue is price times quantity. Your quantity is just the likelihood of them accepting your price. And if you parameterize it by the selling probability, the corresponding revenue curve is concave. That is one way to think about regular distributions. And the monopoly price then just corresponds to the selling probability that maximizes the Y value in this curve. So that would just be sort of right there in the middle. And so what's the role of regularity in sort of, shill bidding not being helpful? Well, so what do you learn as the English auction proceeds? You increasingly learn lower bounds on the valuations of all the remaining bidders. Okay, so if the current price is P, and any bidders that have not yet dropped out, you can condition on their valuation being at least P. And so the question is, now that you know that, would you like to revise the ex-ante optimal reserve price of R star in some way? And with a regular distribution, so with this revenue curve, in fact, even as the current price P starts exceeding the monopoly price R star, you are never incentivized to, you never want a reserve price that would be still higher than that. Okay? There's always sort of negative returns for increasing a reserve price beyond R star. Okay? So that's the role of regularity. Now, with an irregular distribution, where you have a revenue curve which is not concave, this is in fact not in general true. Okay, so you can imagine, for example, with like a bimodal distribution where values might be low or they might be high, and there's some non-trivial chance of both, that as the auction proceeds, if you find out that tons of bidders have much higher valuations than you might have expected a priori, well, now all of a sudden you're pretty sure some bidder is going to have that second mode, that sort of very high distribution. And at that point, shill bid, may then activate to push the price up to that higher amount to sort of extract extra revenue from bidders in that second mode of the valuation distribution once you have sufficient confidence that there will be at least one such bidder. Okay, so the details there aren't so important. The point is just that this seemingly sort of simple question of like, can shill bidding ever be helpful or not, already starts getting pretty interesting even in an English auction. Okay, really, in this case, depends on what type of distribution you're discussing. Okay. All right. So the next point I want to make, let's assume away the complexities of regular distributions for the rest of the talk, at least, by just focusing on the regular case. Okay, so we're going to be looking at valuation distributions that have a corresponding concave revenue curve, or if you prefer, that have a non-negative virtual valuation function, if that's how you prefer to think about it. So this was the case where we argued that there was no benefit to shilling. Okay, but implicit in the discussion so far was an assumption about what it is that the shill bidder knows at the time that it has to decide whether or not to stay in the English auction. And so we were making a reasonable assumption. We were assuming that the shill bidder knew, okay, they knew the prior, and they've observed what's happened in the auction, and that's it. So they know who dropped out and when, and then more to the point, they know who's still in the auction, and they can infer that their valuations are at least the current price P, and they can condition on that information if they want. This was the assumption we made when we argued that shill bidding is not helpful in the regular case with an optimal reserve, but it can be helpful in the irregular case. Let's actually, just as a thought experiment, let's imagine that the shill bidder knew actually quite a bit more than this. Let's imagine that the shill bidder actually knew the realized valuations of all of the real bidders. So not just a lower bound on their valuation, being at least P, let's assume the shill bidder actually literally knows everybody's maximum willingness to pay. Does that change the answer to the question? Does that now enable the shill bidder to boost the seller revenue through shilling? And the answer here is definitely, right? So if you actually know everybody's valuation, so you know the highest valuation is 97, for example, then you're happy to just stay, the shill bidder will just stay in the English auction until the price hits, 96 or 97 before dropping out. So in an English auction, a shill bidder privy to all of the bidder valuations can force the highest valuation bidder to basically pay their valuation. Okay. So the point of this slide is that the answer to this question of can shill bids help the seller, it's going to depend on informational assumptions. It's going to depend on what shill bidders know at the time that they make decisions. Okay. Now, your first reaction to this example might be, okay, but this is like, isn't this kind of like a crazy informational assumption? This kind of like omniscient shill bidder that literally just knows everybody's valuations? Like, of course, such a shill bidder can boost the revenue in the auction. Like in what auction would that not be helpful? Then you think a little bit more, and you're like, well, what's the kind of descending analog of an English auction? It's a Dutch auction. Okay? Maybe with reserve, maybe without, either way. So here we start with a high price. So say the price equal 100, like the maximum valuation. And we decrement the price one at a time. And again, in each iteration, we go through the bidders, let's say one by one in some fixed order. And we ask each remaining bidder whether they want to buy the item right now at the current price or wait and maybe consider it again in the next round if nobody buys it in the meantime. Okay. So that's a Dutch auction. Maybe you count all the way down to 0. Maybe you count down to the monopoly price. On this slide, it's not going to matter. Okay. So let's re-ask the question from the previous slide. Okay. Does a shill bidder who has full knowledge of all of the bidders' valuations, can it boost the seller's revenue? It certainly could in the English auction. It could force the highest valuation bidder to pay its full value. What could a shill bidder do in a Dutch auction? Okay. And again, you don't have to think about this that long before you realize the answer is nothing. Nothing at all. Right? Despite giving the shill bidder all the information it could ever want, it has no ability to boost the seller revenue. Okay. Why not? Well, the only thing a shill bidder can do, right, is bid and win the item at the current price. But then the seller just winds up with the item and makes no revenue. Okay. So anytime a shill bid matters at all in a Dutch auction, it results in the seller holding the item, and therefore it just pays itself in effect. Okay, and there's absolutely no revenue. So Dutch auctions actually do seem to be shill-proof in this extremely strong way, more so than an English auction. Okay, that is sort of the high-level intuition I want everyone to have a feel for at this point. So let me stop for questions.
So, okay, so I have a question. So from the perspective of information structure, what's the difference between the seller and the shill bidder? I mean, because like the seller can set the shill bidder, right? So basically all the information from the seller side can be shared with the shill bidders, right?
Yeah, you should think of them as kind of sharing a brain.
I see. So actually the number of shill bidder doesn't matter, right?
In this particular example, yeah.
But in general.
I'd say for all of the examples thus far, the number of shill bidders has not mattered. Yeah.
I see.
We'll do the formal model in a couple slides, and what you'll see is in our actual model, there will be a variable, a stochastic number of shill bidders. In many cases, kind of all that matters is that you have one. If you go deep enough in the paper, it starts mattering that you could potentially have more than one. But for the main results, I think for this whole talk, I would sort of encourage you to think about the case of one shill bidder. I think that's a fine sort of special case to keep in mind as you try to interpret the results I'm going to discuss today.
I see. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions before I move on? All right, great. So given these examples, some questions, that at least we thought were pretty obvious to ask was, we see these differences, intuitive differences between Dutch and English auctions. And, as auction theorists, we can't help ourselves but want to characterize exactly which auctions are sort of shill-proof in the stronger sense of a Dutch auction and more weakly shill-proof in the sense of an English auction. So we're getting to it for the moment, still a bit informally, with strong shill-proof in the sense of the Dutch auction, meaning that even with full knowledge of valuation, shill bidding is never profitable. Whereas weakly shill-proof in the sense of an English auction, right, that's going to mean that shill bidding is unprofitable in expectation at equilibrium. Okay, so knowing only the prior and whatever information about bidder valuations has been revealed by gameplay thus far. Okay. So those are the first couple of questions. And then furthermore, to what extent are these different types of shill-proofness compatible with other properties that we know and love for auctions, like revenue optimality, efficiency, strategy proofness, and so on. Okay. So these are the main questions that we study in the paper. All right, so this is sort of the midpoint of the talk. This kind of ends the more informal half, and then now we're going to start doing the more formal development from here on. So again, let me just pause to see if there's any questions at this point before we really start kind of getting into the model. All right, great. So I'm not going to talk about all the results in the paper. I'm going to highlight two for you in this talk. But let me just sort of mention that in the paper, we sort of characterize the feasible combinations of properties in single item auctions. So this is, you can think of these tables as kind of a 2D projection of a four-dimensional sort of tensor, where the axes are whether you're strong or weak Shill-Proof, whether you want to be efficient or optimal, whether you have to be strategy or not, and whether you have to sort of have a one-round implementation or not. So with respect to all possible values in those four dimensions, the paper maps out which are achievable and which are not, and with which auction formats those combinations are achievable. And again, I don't have that much time, so let me just talk. I'm going to tell you about two main results. The first main result, which I'll start talking about in the next slide, that'll explain pretty much everything that's going on in these bottom two tables. And then the second main result, which I'll talk about toward the end, that'll explain parts of what's going on in the top two tables of this slide. Okay. So the main thing I want to discuss in this talk, so the first main result, is a characterization of sorts of the Dutch auction as, in some sense, the unique, strongly Shill-Proof auction. Okay. This is not yet a formal statement for two reasons. One reason is I need to give you a formal definition of what I mean by strongly Shill-Proof. The other is there's this asterisk in unique. So I need to give you some technical conditions around that sort of uniqueness statement. Okay, but this is what we're driving toward. And so if you think about that strong Shill-Proof notion, where shill bidders, even with full knowledge of bidder valuations, are not helpful, that really uniquely pins down the Dutch auction. Okay. And one thing we think is like pretty cool about this result is,
So,
in some sense, gives.
It's one question.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, after your example and this result, I guess that you're gonna take as given that the value of the seller is known and equal to 0 all the time, because otherwise this result doesn't seem correct.
Let's see. So for simplicity, we are going to assume that the seller has value 0 for the item. I don't see why that's
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, it could be if at some point as the auction runs, I learn that my value, the seller learns that his value is higher than the current price, he would like to do shield bidding.
Right, but that you would handle with a suitable reserve, right?
No, but that's the point. My point is that if you learn along the auction, so we're thinking of. I thought that you wanted to allow also for the possibility of learning along the auction.
Yeah. So the assumption. So in what I'm going to discuss in this talk, it's going to be the independent private values model. So you are not learning about your own private value as the game proceeds. You are learning about the bidder's values as the game proceeds.
Sure.
If there's time at the end, so they're not in the paper, but we have recently proved various extensions to affiliated values models, and the results are largely the same. And if there's time at the end, I'm happy to talk about that.
I mean, conditional on you still being able to stop the auction, whether you learn about others or not, you would have known ex ante, right? It's conditional on the price dropping to that point. You learn the same before the auction as during. And there isn't really any exogenous flow of information usually in those auctions. They are very fast.
Great. So good. So let me finish what I was saying on this slide. So that's the informal theorem. I definitely owe you, the precise statement of this, and we'll get to that shortly. One of the reasons we're sort of quite excited about this result is you can kind of view it as sort of for the first time a novel origin story for the Dutch auction. So what do we mean by that? Well, when you say, for example, teach a little bit of auction theory, to say a general audience, right? So like maybe you're giving a talk to a bunch of smart high school students or something like that. One strategy that you could employ in a talk like that is to talk about single item auctions and to talk about kind of 4 classic auction formats, right? Namely the 2 classic sealed bid auction formats, first price and second price, and the 2 classic iterative formats, English and Dutch. Okay, so that's kind of auction theory 101, those 4 auction formats for single item auctions. And for 3 of them, there's sort of a lot of ways that we've seen over the decades of singling them out, okay, and putting them on a pedestal, right? So like second price auctions, right? If you want direct revelation and dominant strategies and incompatible, that pins down uniquely the second price auction. First price auctions, English auctions, plenty of examples. Like first price auctions, there's a nice characterization in that Akbarpour Lee paper that I mentioned as the unique, credible, static auction, right? English auctions, for example, in the affiliated values model that we mentioned, in the linkage principle kind of highlights the English auction as, sort of being particularly desirable. And to our knowledge, there are not so many analogs of those kinds of origin stories for the Dutch auction until now, right? So really, if you're interested in an auction format that has very strong Shill-Proof properties, that really does pin down the Dutch auction as the one you want to use.
Can I ask a question about the setting that you're looking at? So you've been it seems like you've been focusing on the, as you call them, the classic auctions. I mean, are you guys looking at this from, let's just look at some particular class of mechanisms that are, for example, anonymous, so they are auctions in some ways, and then you check all these properties against those, or is it a standard optimal mechanism with this constraint added up setting?
I guess I would say the way I think we think about it is, you first of all are interested in some notion of an optimal single item auction, again, in the symmetric setting that we're looking at. So maybe, revenue maximizing, maybe efficient, depending on the case may be. But then you're interested in still additional properties on top of that, which can be discussed only by referring to, not just the direct revelation version of your auction, but actually the possibly non-revelation version of it, right? So like, as we saw in the examples, we're interested in ways in which English auctions differ from Dutch auctions, right? And so really the properties we're interested in are sort of fun, and this is where really there's a very strong parallel to, for example, the obviously strategy proof notion of Lee and the credible auctions notion of Akbarpour and Lee, where really, this perspective that, there's a certain amount that you lose if you work only with direct revelation versions of, for example, single item auctions. There's a lot of richness in thinking about the possibly indirect implementations, which you might be using in practice. So I think that's how we think about it. We in effect start from the constraint of an optimal single item auction, and then we want additional properties, which are going to be a function of the specific implementation that you do of it.
Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So I owe you a formal model. I owe you a formal statement. So let's take care of business. Okay. So single item auction, end bidders. And because we're going to be working with extensive form game formalism, we're going to restrict to finite support valuation distributions. And for simplicity, let's just assume that is a regular distribution. Okay. Now, the way we sort of handle shill bidding is a little bit different than in the examples. And again, we think this is a unusually convenient way to model them because it plays very nicely with sort of the traditional IPV auction theory, which is we're just going to treat whether a bidder is real or shill as part of their private type, okay, along with their valuation. All right. So in addition to the valuation, each bidder is going to be a shill bidder or a real bidder or shill bidder with some probability P. It's again going to be symmetric, so it's an independent probability of P for each of the bidder is going to be a shill. Okay. If your type is of a real bidder, then you additionally have a generally non-zero valuation, which is drawn from the distribution capital F. If your type is that of a shill bidder, then your value is assumed to be 0, and rather than having the usual quasi-linear utility, your utility function is the seller revenue. Okay, so this is again sort of a symmetric Bayesian setup. All right. I guess another way to think about this, you can also think about flipping the coins in the opposite order, right? So you could just imagine like first of all, you draw a valuation from capital F, right, with some extra mass at 0, representing the shill bidders. And then if you happen to draw 0 from capital F, at that point, you flip a second coin to determine whether or not it's actually a real bidder with actual value 0, or whether it's a shill bidder. That's another way to think about it. All right. So as we just discussed, it's really not, you lose too much information if you pass to sort of the direct revelation version and work directly with allocation and payment rules. So exactly as in previous work on, for example, obvious strategy proofness and credible auctions, we will be working with extensive form models of auction. So by an auction, really what we mean is an extensive form game. Okay, so a game tree where the leaves of the game tree are labeled with an allocation, i.e. who wins the item, if anybody, and payments. Okay, so what that winner pays.
Tim?
Yep.
So, I mean, it is a very elegant, indeed, way to simplify the problem, this idea of drawing a real bidder or shield bidder as part of the type. But how should I think about that in the context of shield bidding? Right? It's because shield bidders are effectively representatives of the seller. So should I think that some people came up and I think, well, they expected 20 of them, so I will send 4 more? Is that the idea? Or
I mean, I would just
I'm sending people and randomly some are selected, some of which are real bidders, some of which are my representatives. Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, if I go and submit a bid on a used car auction in eBay Motors, right, I maybe in my mind have the thought that, you know, each bid that I see has some likelihood from being from a shill bidder, right, and I go to formulate my best response, like with respect to those beliefs. So I don't think of it as anything more than that.
Can I intervene here, because I was actually thinking along similar. So imagine that, for example, instead of this setup that you guys have, you had a setup where with some probability there is a shill bidder in the game. The seller wants to shill bid and he's going to use, I think, one shill bidder will work here, right? So it's a slightly different thing. Wouldn't you so certainly in that setting, you would update your beliefs about whether somebody's a shill bidder over time, I think, because that's a possibility. Here, it seems like you guys are kind of shutting that down because everybody could be a shill bidder. So I think that would be a little bit different. So in a way, it makes it simpler and perhaps cleaner, but I'm wondering whether it is what I described as a more realistic setting where with some probability the seller decides to intervene and some probability he doesn't, or he's a type that wants to cheat and some probability he's a type that doesn't want to cheat. You see what I mean? I don't know whether I'm making sense here, but I hope I am.
Yeah, so I agree that, you know, a priori, you know, there's various ways one could imagine mathematically modeling sort of the concept of shill bidders, and, you know, to our taste, this model gives by far the most kind of helpful guidance and theory on the other side. So, but there's no question. I mean, there's also a contemporaneous paper of ours, which does have a different way of how they, you know, a different model of how the participants reason about the possibility of other shills. So there's certainly other models one could use, but again,
do you allow updating beliefs on the shill thing?
Say it again.
So do you allow bidders to update whether some bidder is a shill or not?
Yeah, we do allow that, but we're going to look at Shill-Proof equilibrium, which means that bidders are not going to be shill bidders or not play like bidders different than they would be real bidders with value 0.
Okay, thanks.
So given that it's a shill-proof auction, there's no reason to reason about it, right? Whether they're shills or not. The definition is going to be they act as if they were real bidders with value 0. So, you know, it really doesn't matter to you what their actual private real versus shill type is, if it's a shill-proof auction, right? If it's not a shill-proof auction, that's a different story.
So here P is determined by the seller, right? So basically seller can P the known probability P is determined by seller in advance, right? So basically seller knows the number of like real bidders and he can decide how many, you know, shill bidders he wants to insert into the auction, right?
So we want to make being shill-proof as kind of demanding as possible in some sense. So we, in effect, allow the shill bidders to kind of know who each other are and to, in effect, collude with each other how they wish.
I see. But how about real bidders? So basically, real bidders also know the probability for like the probability of shill bidders among all bidders.
Real bidders
right?
know P. Yeah, P is, again, it's just like the valuation. It's just part of the prior, and whether you're real or shill is part of your private type.
I see.
Okay, great. So auctions for us, they're not allocation payment rules. They're really sort of game trees with each leaf labeled with an allocation and payment. And so a strategy is now not just a map, it's not just a mapping from a valuation to a bid, for example, as it would be in a direct revelation mechanism. It really says as a function of your valuation, what you would do at every moment in time that you might be asked to take an action in this extensive form game. Okay, so it maps your valuation plus a current information set at which you're the player to move to an action that you're going to take in that information set. And the equilibrium concept is, I think, the one you would expect. Perfect Bayesian equilibrium is what we're going to be thinking about. All right, so in the informal theorem, there was an asterisk in unique star. So this is the slide where I just briefly say what's hidden by that asterisk. So we're going to be restricting attention to equilibria of auctions that have the following properties. So first of all, we're going to be looking at ex post individually rational auction equilibria. Okay, so no matter what the realization of others' valuations, you are guaranteed non-negative utility if you play your equilibrium strategy. We're going to be looking at ex post monotone payments. So the winning bidder's payment is non-decreasing in the values of all the other bidders at equilibrium. And then finally, there's a technical assumption about tie breaking. So the assumption is that there's some fixed ordering over the bidders so that whenever you have a tie of who has the maximum valuation, that the winner is chosen according to that fixed tie breaking rule. Okay. So when we talk about, when we talk about there is no auction equilibrium that's strongly Shill-Proof or something like that, what we're going to really mean is there's no auction equilibrium that satisfies these technical conditions and then also is strongly Shill-Proof. Okay. So this is the star, and I'm not going to mention these again after this slide. Okay. So for the rest of the talk, these are the assumptions about auction equilibria that we talk about.
So, I mean, I don't want to take too much time because you still have two theorems to show us. But those results, are those for technical convenience, or you have examples where things can be Shill bidding in a highly non-trivial way? I mean, Shill bid proof in a highly non-trivial way if you allow non-monotonic equilibria, say.
Yeah. So it's kind of, I mean, I would say for the most part, they're both technical, but also in some sense necessary for the statements as stated to be true. But sort of the way the statement breaks down is, I think in all of these cases, uninteresting. Like, so for example, this last one, right? So if you allow ties to be broken inconsistently, right, all of a sudden, you can kind of have, a few more Shill-Proof auctions because it just so happens that the ways of shilling that you think would actually help, because the ordering does something weird, actually nobody sees the Shill bid, and so it doesn't matter, right? So you do get these kind of edge cases that creep in if you relax these assumptions too much. But so I view it as kind of a technical question, exactly how much you can relax these and how much you can sort of keep the spirit of our results the same. That's kind of the high level. That'd be my summary of it.
Yeah. Thank you. They are all not.
Yeah. Andrew, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Nope, I think that's exactly right. I think they're sort of necessary for our results, but like the ways they break down are uninteresting and a little bit pathological.
Yeah. Okay. So unless requested, I won't be discussing those conditions again. All right. So strongly Shill-Proof, right? So what does it mean to be as Shill-Proof as the Dutch auction? Okay. So we talk about an auction being strongly Shill-Proof. Actually, not quite. We talk about a specific equilibrium of an auction being strongly Shill-Proof if for every realization of the Shill bidders and every realization of the valuations of the real bidders, that's the kind of as if the Shill bidders know the real bidders' valuation. So for every realization of the non-Shill bidders, seller revenue is maximized when all the Shill bidders act as if they are real bidders with value 0. Okay. That's what it means to be strongly Shill-Proof. So even if the Shill bidders all know who each other are, even if they know the values of all the non-Shill bidders, there's literally nothing they can do. Okay, they may as well just kind of sit out the process. Nothing they can do can actually help ever the seller revenue. Okay. And as we've seen, the Dutch auction is strongly Shill-Proof. So when we speak about an auction being strongly Shill-Proof, what we mean is there exists an equilibrium of that auction that is strongly Shill-Proof. So for the Dutch auction, we're talking about sort of the canonical equilibrium, the one that's equivalent to the equilibrium bids in a first price auction. And as we've seen, the English auction, even if you use an optimal reserve price, and even if it's a regular distribution, is not going to be strongly Shill-Proof in this sense, because, right, so given the realization of the valuation profile of the non-Shill bidders, there's an incentive to push the price of the English auction all the way up to the highest valuation of one of the real bidders. Okay. All right. So now one sort of tricky question is, how should one think about a first price auction in this context? Okay, so is a first price auction with an optimal reserve price strongly Shill-Proof or not? Okay. And the reason this is subtle is this is going to depend on the information structure that you're working with. Okay. And so for our first result, our first main result, which is going to pin down uniquely the Dutch auction, that is going to be with respect to a particular assumption on the information structure. Okay. And so specifically, our first main result is about what we call the public setting. Now, so if you have in your mind something like kind of a sealed bid, first price auction or something like that, you should ask yourself, okay, how does that actually map onto, like, normally we don't use extensive form games to think about sealed bid, single shot auctions, but what if we did? Well, game trees by definition, like one player moves at a time, right? You have these levels of the game tree, and like each time exactly one player moves. So it's somehow like inherently sequential, just the game tree formalism. Now, using appropriate information sets, you can, of course, simulate the idea of simultaneous moves, right? Just by having players unaware of the actions that other players have previously taken, okay? So that is not what we're going to be looking at in this first main result. We're actually going to be looking at the opposite. So by the public setting, we're going to be interested in a setup like the English and Dutch auctions that we were thinking about. Okay, so like you go to a fish market, right, and there's a Dutch auction that everyone's competing in. Or you go to Christie's, right, and there's an English auction to sell off a painting with people bidding in an open outcry auction. That is the information structure that we're going to be thinking about for this first main result. The public setting, where every action taken by a participant in this game is publicly observable. Okay? Or equivalently, we're going to assume that all of the information sets are singletons. Okay? So for those of you familiar with the credible auctions work, I mean, another way to sort of think about this paper is it's sort of, or part of this paper, is it asks, how do things change if you kind of use the opposite communication setup from the Akbarpour and Lee paper? So they, in Akbarpour and Lee with credible auctions, for them, the auctioneer is really a gatekeeper of information. Okay, in their model, the auctioneer has a private channel by which they talk to each of the participants, and the auctioneer can selectively disclose or make up information as they see fit to the participants, subject to this condition of being a safe deviation, which is kind of not that relevant for us right now. Okay, so in Akbarpour and Lee, in the credible auctions theory, information is just disclosed only as the auctioneer sees fit. We're working in the absolute opposite setting, where every action anyone takes is publicly visible to all. Okay. Obviously, not all auctions are run in a public setting, but many are. And in particular, if you think about all of the motivating examples we started with, English and Dutch auctions, those often are run in a public setting where you have sort of full view. Okay. If you have a perfectly implemented sealed bid auction where there's literally like no leakage, sort of what's happening, that would not obviously be an auction in the public setting. Okay, so a sealed bid first price auction in the way you probably have it in your mind would be outside the model of this first theorem, because that would not be in the public setting. One thing I do want to mention is that when you try to implement an actual simultaneous sealed bid auction in practice, especially in a digital context, it's often not that easy. And so something that you might want to think about as if it was a sealed bid auction may not be. eBay auctions, for example, like one usually colloquially kind of describes them as a Vickrey auction, as a second price auction, but they are not. They happen over time, and every time there's a new bid, that new bid is seen by everybody participating in the auction. Okay, so eBay auctions really do actually take place in what we're calling here the public setting. And again, I don't want to get too far into it, but one of our motivations at the very beginning of this project was thinking about auctions that are run on public blockchains. And there, even if you're trying to run just sort of a first price auction, whether you like it or not, the way the technology works, you are running that auction in the public setting. Okay. So point being, public setting, it is a restriction, but we think it's a relevant restriction for many of the applications that we were interested in. Okay. All right. And so now what is the formal statement of the uniqueness result. So the formal statement is that in the public setting, an optimal auction is strongly Shill-Proof if and only if it is a Dutch auction with the appropriate reserve price R star, okay, with R star equal to the monopoly price for the valuation distribution, capital F. Why do I say a Dutch auction rather than the Dutch auction? Because there is this degree of freedom with respect to how you break ties. Okay, so for each sort of ordering over the bidders, there's a corresponding Dutch auction which breaks ties in that ordering. Okay. So that's the formal statement of result number one. So this is for optimal auctions, meaning revenue maximizing auctions. There's an analogous result you can state for efficient auctions, where you want the item to always be allocated and to always be allocated to the bidder with the highest valuation. And so here, efficient auctions in the public setting are strongly Shill-Proof if and only if it's a Dutch auction now with zero reserve. Okay. And interestingly, the statement we prove here is actually quite a bit stronger, which is that even if you expand what you're thinking about to weakly Shill-Proof auctions, which I haven't defined yet, but for example, English auctions are weakly Shill-Proof. Even if you look at weakly Shill-Proof auctions, the only way to get an efficient auction in the public setting is using a Dutch auction with no reserve. Okay. For example, if you tried to use an English auction with no reserve, right, if that was your attempt to have an efficient auction, right, the issue is that in that case, shill bidding could drive the reserve price up from zero to the monopoly price as we saw, and you would lose efficiency in that case. Okay. Whereas with the Dutch auction, you can go all the way down to zero, and still shill bidding can't mess with anything. So you actually get efficiency, you get strong Shill-Proofness in some sense for free, right? If all you wanted was weak Shill-Proofness and efficiency, you wind up getting strong Shill-Proofness in addition because you have to use a Dutch auction. Okay. So any questions about that? Okay, in that case, I think I want to ask for a quick, so I'm running out of time, so I really have to make a choice. I could say a little bit about how the proof of this theorem works, not much, but I could say a little bit about that, or I could say a little bit about main result number two, which is a trilemma discussing to what extent weak Shill-Proofness is compatible with other properties you might want, like strategy proofness or one-round implementations. Does anyone want to cast any votes on that decision?
Number two.
Number two, okay.
Yeah,
Any,
second.
You second it? Okay.
Yes.
Any objections to moving this main result number two? All right, so let's do it. Okay, we'll skip this slide. So strong Shill-Proofness, not many auction formats are strongly Shill-Proof, right? It really pins you down to the Dutch auction and that's it. And we saw in their original examples, right, that if you relax the notion of Shill-Proofness, you get other things. In particular, you get English auctions. And so the second result is meant to explore that richer design space thoroughly. So what's the formal definition of weak Shill-Proofness? So again, we're talking about an auction equilibrium. And so here it should be the case that for every realization of the shill bidders, the expected seller revenue, okay, so now we're integrating over the valuations of the real bidders with respect to the prior, rather than asking for something point-wise over those valuations. So the expected seller revenue is maximized when all the shill bidders act as if they are real bidders with value zero, okay? i.e. as long as they don't shill. And we saw that with a regular distribution, an English auction with an optimal reserve price is weakly Shill-Proof in this case. And that's because sort of at every moment in time, given what you know about the remaining bidders and their valuations, by regularity, it is still never in the seller's interest to artificially push the selling price up beyond where it already is. And that's not a unique example. There's many other examples, and I'll defer to the paper. But for example, one thing you can do is you can take an English auction and you can stop it early while you still have more than one bidder remaining, and then run a second price auction on whoever's left, okay? And so how long you have to wait before you can switch from an English auction to a second price auction, that depends on the prior. But for any given prior, there will be some price at which it's safe to just truncate the auction and finish it off in one shot. That would be another example of a weakly Shill-Proof auction, okay? All right, so to state the trilemma, I need one other definition. which is the notion of a single action auction. Okay? And so this is an auction in which each bidder moves exactly once. Okay? So like if you took what you think of as a sealed bid first price or second price auction and you mapped that to this game tree formalism, you would get a single item auction, right? You get a game tree with n levels, one level for each bidder. Each bidder would move exactly once and their actions would correspond to their bids. Dutch auctions, English auctions are not single action, right? Because bidders in general are going to act many times, like once per iteration of the auction, okay? And so the trilemma states that among optimal auctions, you can achieve 2 and only 2 of the following 3 properties, okay, being single action, okay, so corresponding in some sense to a sealed bid auction, strategy proofness, okay, so meaning that it's a dominant strategy to reveal your valuation, or weakly Shill-Proof. Okay. So we're leaving aside strong Shill-Proofness. Strong Shill-Proofness, remember, pins you down to the Dutch auction. So here we're relaxing that to weakly Shill-Proof. But even for that relaxed weakly Shill-Proof notion, you cannot on top of it have both strategy proofness and the single action property. It might be easiest to interpret this if I talk through how you would achieve the different pairs of 1 through 3. And interestingly, as you go through these pairs, you actually generate the other 3 of the 4 basic auction formats. Right? We already recovered the Dutch auction as sort of the unique, strongly strategy-proof one. Among these 3 properties, as you look at the pairs, you get the other 3. If you want to be single auction and strategy-proof, use a Vickrey auction, with an optimal reserve. If you want to be single action, you don't care about strategy proof, but you want to be weakly Shill-Proof, use a first price auction. If you just want to be strategy proof and weakly Shill-Proof, then as we know, you can use an English auction. Okay. If you can get any pair of these, you cannot get all 3. Which means that these 2 main results kind of show that this is the landscape of Shill-Proof auctions. Okay, so on the right, strongly Shill-Proof, you have this little island, right? You've got like the Dutch auction and nothing else. And then on the left, you've got weakly Shill-Proof auctions. And there you have a sort of richer array of what is possible. Okay. So again, if people want any extra time, I can talk about the proof, but I'm not going to talk about it now. Yeah, so I think I should probably just wrap up. So I do have slides on credibility if people want sort of a more nuanced discussion about how the Shill-Proofness work in this paper compares to the credibility work of Akbarpour and Lee. Happy to talk about that, or sort of other related work. But to leave time for Q&A, let me just sort of wrap up with the summary slide here, and I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. So we open the Q&A section of the talk. So I'm going to start by asking the panelists if they have any remaining question or comment that they want to make now. So Marek, for instance, do you want to start?
I've been asking questions as we went along. I mean, the only comment I would like to make, I think, Tim, you referred to that parallel paper with different assumptions on how Shill bits arrive, and I think I've seen the author of that paper. Yes, I see. Hyun Zheng is also with us today. So.
Oh, great. Yeah, so there's a very nice contemporaneous work by Zheng, which I have to apologize. Online, I'm forgetting the details of it, but basically, it's a different model for how the real bidders reason about the presence of shills, and yeah, I mean, actually, would you actually let me invite Hao Yang? Can I just actually invite you to talk a bit about what your model is like and what the results are?
Oh, thanks. So basically, so in my paper, basically the seller can have kind of the freedom of choosing how many shills they want to send in the auction. So basically, the seller can send 1 shill, can send 2 shills, and the auction format actually can depend on the number of bidders in the auction. So you could run the first price auction with 5 bidders, and then run the second price auction for more than 5 bidders. So it's kind of then in that case, so basically the idea is kind of like the shill bidding can affect the auction outcome in 2 ways. First, you could kind of affect the auction format by changing the number of shills you send in the auction.
Second, you could, given the number of shares you have committed to the auction, you could kind of think about what's the optimal strategy for the seller to bid in the auction. And then basically the result in that paper is kind of like, in such an auction, actually, you should consider whether you should disclose the number of bidders to the audience. Then in my paper, basically, the idea is kind of like, when the seller can send different number of shares to the auction, then from the designer's perspective, actually, it's better to conceal the information. So you should run an auction without disclosing number of bidders to the audience. So still, the Dutch or the first price auction is good, but it's good in under the condition that you should conceal the information. So you can run the first price auction without disclosing the number of bidders. Then basically every kind of real buyer, they will form the expectation about how competitive the auction is, and then we'll just still submit a bid. And then there's no way for the seller to affect either the kind of the perceived competition in the auction or the winning price for the buyer, because if you consider kind of traditional first price auction, then everybody sees the number of bidders in the auction, and what the seller can do is basically they make the auction room very crowded. So buyer walk in the room, they see a number of kind of people sitting in the room, and they say, oh, this is a very competitive auction because so many people seems to be interested in it. And then they will just bid high for that. But if you conceal the information, which is, I think it's more true in kind of online setting, because the designer has the control over the kind of show the information whether how many people are interested in the option. But in that case, they should kind of conceal the information rather than not. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. And I'd encourage you to post a link to the paper in the chat for the seminar.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Otherwise, on my side, thank you. That was an excellent talk, as usual.
Thanks.
Maybe Zhou, you have a final question or comment?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I enjoy the talk a lot, and I have very small questions, or I want to ask for your comment. So here, do you think we can define Shill-Proof in a different sense? Meaning, so for example, the seller's revenue is independent of the number of the bidders or the Shill bidders. And if we define the Shill-Proofness in that sense, do you have any comment about the result?
If we
I mean, for example, the seller's revenue is independent of number of Shill bidders.
Okay. So I'm not totally following. I mean, here.
I just try to use a different way to define the Shill-Proofness, right? So
I see what you're saying. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think this does get back into the same modeling question of like, how do the real bidders reason about the presence or absence of shills? I mean, I think one still has to solve the question in that version of it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, one would have to think through a reasonable way, a good way to do that.
Yeah, I mean, because from my own perspective, there are different ways to talk about like Shill-Proofness, right? So I mean, if we consider another version of Shill-Proofness and whether your result can carry over or whatever, yeah, that's my curiosity.
Yeah, no, I think we would welcome alternative approaches to modeling Shill bidders and other sets of results. We experimented with a few different ones, and we felt this version of the theory gave by far the most interesting and sort of helpful guidance around auction design. So this is kind of the one that we're focused on.
I see.
I don't know, Scott, Andrew, anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I think if you just, again, Tim's right, like the big issue with most definitions, understanding how real bidders like reason about Shill bidders or the presence of them. In that other model, I think probably for appropriately defined equilibrium concept, this result probably still holds the exact same way. Just given how the proof works, because the way the proofs work is that it doesn't really matter how many Shill bidders are actually realized in the game. You need the same results will hold. So I suspect it would work the same if we define an appropriate equilibrium concept, but that might be a little bit challenging to do so.
Yeah, and maybe add on to that. I mean, one thing, I mean, with like, even if you just change this model where there's just like one shill and it's like chosen uniformly at random from the n bidders, but you introduce sort of correlations between bidders types, which, you know, just as we sort of know from even just traditional auction theory, like that can sometimes be, even if it superficially adds realism, if you actually like work out the theory, right, optimal auction theory kind of becomes actually significantly less helpful with a kind of, you know, richer model of bidder correlations. And so my feeling was some of that same tension was at work here.
Good. So we have time for more questions. And
Can I ask a question?
sure.
So you briefly mentioned that you've got new results, and that for the case where there's a affiliation, so you know, common values and so on. So it's pretty obvious that in a common value setting, the Dutch auction is still very robust because you don't learn anything from other people's bidders. But in an English auction, I've always actually felt this was one of the main reason for shilling is to sort of, you know, suppose that you're selling an antique on eBay or something like that, something that's difficult to value for most people, and you start putting up, you know, it looks very old, it looks beautiful, but is it really valuable? Is it something? And so what you can do is, you know, as a seller, you can maybe put some shill bids at the beginning to sort of set up this thing that it's actually quite valuable. This is the sort of thing I would be worrying about if I was bidding for an antique on eBay. So I wonder whether this affects the English auction significantly, those weak Shill-Proof results. Am I on the right track, or can you give us a sense of how the commonality affects the results?
Yeah. So, you know, our main results about this trilemma and this uniqueness of the Dutch auction hold. And it's true that the way that like the English auction becomes with enough affiliation won't be Shill-Proof weekly. The exact condition though to come up with is a little bit challenging to write down because the way affiliation sort of interacts with the regularity assumptions, like these revenue curves, is complicated. So we haven't found a nice condition on when the English auction is no longer weekly Shill-Proof.
Yeah, maybe just to add a little more color there. I mean, so you know, just to be clear, so the Dutch auction, like you say, no problem. It really doesn't matter kind of what. It's very robust, right? Like kind of no matter what you throw at it, it's going to remain strongly Shill-Proof. And with affiliation, there's a sense in which it's only harder to be Shill-Proof. So if you go from kind of sort of IPV to kind of like affiliated with the same marginals, you can only flip from Shill-Proof to non-Shill-Proof, not the other way around. And so that means when you have a uniqueness result, like main result number one is in some sense only more true in the affiliated case, because sort of all the non-Dutch auctions are in some sense even farther from being strongly Shill-Proof. Well, the Dutch auction remains strongly Shill-Proof. And then the same thing for, you know, weak Shill-Proofness when you're talking about, you know, kind of uniqueness results or failures of that property.
So now the next question is, why doesn't eBay use Dutch auctions? Because they might. I mean, your result, I mean, you know, no, you have to work out a model and so on, but sort of the intuition that you don't learn anything on the Dutch auction and so on is kind of the basic intuition. I was thinking about that, and it seems to me that part of the problem is that it's difficult to set the upper bound and then start going down. It is difficult to implement for a large variety of different items, I suppose. Well, you need something that's more or less like the flowers auction, right? It's more or less homogenized. There's been a lot of history. People more or less know what a reasonable starting point is. But if you're selling entirely very, very different things, I wonder whether maybe you could ask. I mean, it would be nice to think about what would the seller do here. I mean, maybe you should be the one as a seller that sets the highest price and then starts going down and so on.
Yeah, so two quick notes on that actually. Like, so I think the intuition's right. I think the challenge with doing formal Dutch auctions on a setting like eBay is that the asynchrony is an issue, right? Like eBay counts on having users show up at random times looking for random things, and you might, it might not work if you have to count on the users showing up at random times to look for random things and have the price be in the right range. But I think actually there's a coarse version of exactly what you were proposing going on with sellers and descending buy it now prices, right? Like you will see sellers like, set a buy it now price and then oftentimes adjust it in various ways algorithmically, but usually like, if they have a unique object, they might start at a high price and later, decrease it and sort of like leave it as that buy it now price for a while until it sells, or engage in private negotiations. There are now tools where you can counter offer to a buy it now offer. So I think the intuition of what you're saying may actually very much be right. It's just likely being implemented in this asynchronous approximation.
I almost never buy anything on eBay. I don't buy that much, but through auctions, essentially. Maybe because I know enough that I'm not supposed. So yeah, I use buy it now quite a bit if it is there. So yeah, I guess that's me being worried about shills.
So exactly. probably it's good time, that we stop the official part of the talk, and we thank our speaker, panelists, and co-authors for coming today. And well, I mean, I'm going to stop the recording, but if you want to stay a few minutes, it's more than welcome.
Thanks, everyone.
So